Good morning, everybody. Sorry we're a couple minutes behind, but we're going to get started. So, in case you didn't get the memo, you don't have a handout. We're talking about brace rod installation today. Who here has ever installed a brace rod? Doesn't, whether it's for another employer, Russell Tree experts. All right. This can be a relatively simple process, but can get complicated by the height and the twist in the wood grain very quickly. So we're going to talk about kind of how to work with those things and the process. We're going to go through these installation steps on how to install these rods. Now, if you notice, I've skipped ahead quite a few steps just for time's sake. You don't have to sit here and watch me drill a hole through this union, but we're going to pretend that we're doing it all together, step by step. Okay? And I don't know where Todd went. Thank you, Todd, for giving us our nice example to work with. Okay. So, who here knows what is the point of brace rods? Anybody want to describe that for the group? Schneider.
To mitigate the risk of union failure.
To mitigate the risk of union failure. That is a textbook definition. Anybody else want to? Yeah.
I'd say just as simple as tree stability.
As simple as tree stability. Yeah, yeah. Anybody else want to add to that? So we're mitigating risk failure for a union. Now, is this the perfect example of a union that may need a brace rod? No, but it's definitely a union, and it's something that Todd happened to come across yesterday. So that's what we're going to use. It pays the bills, right? Right. Although there is kind of a little cavity here, so if someone was super concerned about it, you could still do this to a perfectly healthy union, strong union. So, yes, so brace rods, they are used to help mitigate the risk of a weak union. What might be a weak union that we would want to mitigate the risk of? Describe it.
Included bark.
Included bark. Yep, what else?
Codominant.
Codominant. Yep.
Tight.
Yeah, a tight V-shaped union. What else? Cracks, splits, seams. Yeah. Any of those things. Those are predominantly what we're going to be putting brace rods in for. I can't recall off the top of my head. You can obviously put these in even if you have a nice healthy U-shaped union like this, just to help reinforce that if you've got a enormous lead off of one side or the tree's still codominant but happens to have a nice structural union. Okay, now before we start going through the steps, if you look at the diagram sheet, this table, this is taken directly out of this A300 Tree Support Systems Best Management Practices book. That's a mouthful. This goes over cabling, bracing, guying, which is supporting trees from the outside, and then propping, right? We're talking about the bracing portion of it today. So you will find this page in here. It just happens to be blown up so that we can all read it and study it. Now, if you look at the bottom, it says Table 6, minimum diameter and number of steel rods to install for bracing trees. If we start at the left, it says diameter below the junction in inches. Junction is a fancy way of saying union, right? So what's really the first thing you should be looking at? The diameter, right? And we're not talking about DBH. What's DBH stand for? Diameter of breast height, which is roughly 4.5 inches. Feet, thank you. Inches, not inches, I promise. I went ahead and measured this just below this union. It comes out to about 27.5 inches. Okay? So using this table, what size of brace rod does this union require? 3/4 inch, right? Because if we look, it says diameter below the junction in inches. 20 inches to 40 inches, look one column right, and you've got 3/4, right? Now go one more column to the right, minimum number of rods in trees with. It says split limbs or no split in the union. If we're going with the split limb column, how many rods do we need to put in? Minimum. 3, right? And then an additional rod for every 8 inches above 30 inches, right? So what does that mean? That means that if I measure a union that is 39 inches, am I going with the 40-inch diameter, or am I going with, the 40-inch and greater 7/8 brace rod, or am I going with the 20 to 40 3/4 inch brace rod?
20 to 40.
20 to 40.
You're just using an extra brace rod.
You're using 2 extra brace rods. This is kind of a weird part, and I just want to make sure everybody understands it. 1 rod for each 8 inches, right? So if I've got a 38-inch tree, I'm putting in 4 rods. If I've got anything over 38 but below 40, which is literally just 39, I gotta have 5. Admittedly, I got into a debate with my wife on this the other night, and she said, if you're using it like you use construction code, this is how you would use it. I said, that makes sense. It's a little goofy, but anything, above 40, you don't have to worry about that. You go to the next rod size up and follow along the table. Does that make sense? How to use this table? Yeah? I get some head nods. Okay, we'll work through it again once we go through the steps, but I wanted to hit on that first. This diagram gives us a nice, visual aid. If you look at it, it says B, which is the measurement. Measure here to determine total number of rods. That's that diameter below the union, which is the 27.5 for this tree. The next step would be to measure, if you look at the A here, would be to measure the larger of the 2 or 3 or 4 or how many liters you have. The largest one, measure that diameter, and that tells you how far up from the bottom of the union that first rod needs to be. The first and highest rod is arguably the most important one, and it will characteristically always be above the union, right? A lot of people think that, oh, I've got a seam down here, I need to put rods down here. That's true, but this one is going to be the most important. So I did not take the liberty of measuring this. Yeah, I did not take the liberty of measuring this, but if this was, let's say, 20 inches, right? And we're looking at this diagram, how far up above the union do we need to put the first rod? There's a range. What's that? Be confident. So if you look at A, where it's 20 inches, look to the left. It says install at least 1 rod in this area. It says A times 1 to A times 2. So I've got a 20 inches is A. How far up do I need to be? 20 to 40. Yep, 20 to 40 inches above the bottom of this union. Now, why do they give us a range? Because they know trees aren't perfect, right? So anywhere from 20 inches to 40 inches above this union. Now, obviously I don't have anything higher to work with. That's why this one's lower, but this is just for demonstration purposes. Does that kind of make sense? How to work through just this? Right? Now, full discretion, all of that math and really that placement of the rods falls on the RM to figure out, right? You shouldn't be standing in the field trying to do all this math and figuring that out. But it's important for you all to understand it in case there's a mix-up and something goes wrong and you're already there with all the equipment and we're billing the customer for it. Okay?
Yeah, it's also important to note the minimum requirements too,
Mm-hmm.
when spacing rods.
Yes.
And that number is 12 inches.
Yep.
Like you said, it's not perfect.
Yep.
And oftentimes we'll get other unions or branches that split out from the trunk.
Mm-hmm.
You can go down to at least 12 inches. spacing.
Yeah. Yep. Did everybody hear that? So yes, thank you, Mac. That was correct. Each of the rods, because we're going to be putting in, like for this guy, it would be 3 3/4 inch rods. You would need to make sure that they are roughly 12 inches apart, right? So we'll get to that step a little bit later as well. All right, turn to the RTE brace rod installation steps. Normally I would have you each read these, but I'm going to read them all just for the sake of it being recorded. So number 1 says, make sure that any aerial work being done to the tree's crown, including pruning and cabling, are complete. These may change the shape of the union if not completed beforehand. It is very, very, very important that any and all of the weight that's way up here in the crown, if you're going to take some weight off or change the characteristic of that union with a cable, right, which is arguably going to pull them in a little bit, that is done before you start drilling holes in the bottom down here. Does anybody know why? Alignment. Yeah, alignment. Yeah. It was going to be super, super frustrating if you're like, hey, you know, Charlie or whoever might be on the ground, I'm going to start doing the pruning and the cabling. If you just want to start poking holes in the bottom of the tree and start shoving rods in, you do that at the same time. And let's say you get to the cabling part and you start tensioning up that tree. All of a sudden, these holes are going to start moving. It doesn't seem like they would, but they will move slightly. That will throw everything out of alignment. Does that make sense? So there's an order of operations here. Make sure everything that needs to be done up top is done before you start installing brace rods. The only caveat to that is if it's just a pure brace rod job and you're not doing anything to the crown, right? I think that's going to be kind of rare, but it may happen, right? Number 2, confirm the diameter of the trunk below the union needing support. If not specified on the work order already, use the ANSI A300 Tree Support Systems BMP book to determine the size, number, and placement of rods. That's kind of what we've discussed already here. I did not print out the different techniques for placing the brace rods, but we can talk about that a little bit more at the end. Step 3, measure the diameter of the largest lead that is included in the union that's requiring the support. Okay, we've talked about that already. Using the measurement in step 3, the first brace rod should be installed 1 to 2 times this diameter above the union. So again, we've got a 20-inch lead over here. It's got to be anywhere from 20 inches to 40 inches. Somewhere in that range is where that first rod has to go. Make sense? Yeah? Okay. Step 5, mark this rod's location on the trunk. Now, how do we do that? Preferably we don't do it with spray paint, because spray paint is a little more permanent, right? A lumber stick, lumber crayon works really well for this, right? You can just give yourself like a little X or something right here, if you know that's where you kind of want it. May not be able to see, I kind of marked this line for helping me to line it up when I was angling the drill bit. But this is pretty handy. These live in here. Now, before we move on, we're going to go over a little bit. We're going to go over a little bit the different sizes of rods. On the ground over here, if you can see these, we've got a 1/2 inch threaded rod, a 5/8 threaded rod, the 3/4 is what's sticking in out of the tree right now, and then you've got a 7/8 threaded rod. Okay. Each of these have a drill bit that is used for them. The drill bit is always going to be a 1/16 of an inch larger, just like when we're doing cabling, right? It's just a little bit larger, gives you enough room to put the rod through, but we're not making this giant cavity that the tree has to compartmentalize later on. Make sense? I'm not going to do the math right now, but I think the big one's 15/16. Yep. And I guess, yeah, this bottom, this small one is 9/16. Yes. Okay. That goes along with this handy dandy box. Because you have different rod sizes, you're going to need different hardware for each of the rod sizes, right? So you've got everything from a 1/2 inch rod to a 5/8 rod to a 3/4 inch rod to a 7/8 inch rod. Does that make sense? All 4 of those sizes live in here. You just have to pick the right box. Okay? When we get to it as well, there is the right size ratcheting box wrench to tighten these nuts down, depending on which one you're going to be using. And then lastly, you're going to have a Forstner bit, and we'll talk about this as we get into the next steps. This helps get rid of any chunky bark that might impede you tightening those nuts down, right? Because you want to tighten them down against sound wood, not against bark. Think of like a cottonwood, right? It's probably got like 1 inch to 3 inches of bark normally. You want to get rid of that so that you're not squishing those rods against the soft bark, because that might make those nuts come loose over time. That's exactly what we don't want to have happen. Questions on the hardware and the tools?
Will the wrenches be in that box?
Yep, yeah, all of the sizes and all the wrenches, all the hardware will live in this box. Doesn't matter what size rod you're putting in. So ideally, and actually I meant to say that, so thank you.
If it's put back.
If it's put, yes, if it's put back, please put it back. The auger bits will have a PVC tube that they live in. The rods will have another PVC tube that they live in, right? So you've got 2 PVC tubes, hardware box, and a box for the Milwaukee hole hog, which is what you're going to be using to drill the holes into the tree, right? This has a lot more juice than the drill that we used to use, and personally I'm a fan of not using a drill anymore. For those of you that don't know, I guess the context to my last comment is I have broken these 3 bones doing brace rods before. So it's kind of a serious note. I mean, you're messing with a super long auger bit, and you've got something that will spit out just a stupid amount of torque, right? If you're not in the best work positioning, like I wasn't, I was in the spider lift and I was drilling like this, right? It's a great way to start breaking bones and hurting yourself, right? That's all I'm gonna say on that. But just take that with a grain of salt. So we marked the rod location, right? And now we're on step 6. So using a Forstner bit, remove any bark that may impede the washer from seating against sound wood on the trunk. Now, for our example tree, there is no there is no bark on this trunk. I still did it. You're not gonna be able to see it very well, but you don't want to be drilling into the wood, right? The reason behind the Forstner bit, again, is so that this washer can seat against sound wood and not just squishy bark. Does that make sense? Okay, so you've done that, and that's literally, I mean, that's just a little hole. You're not getting crazy with this. That's just to help seat the washer. Step 7, using an auger bit a 1/16 of an inch larger than the threaded rod being installed, drill a linear hole perpendicular to the center of the union. Is this threaded rod parallel to the ground right now? No. Why is that? Because it's got to be perpendicular to the union. Yeah, this union is not perfectly, straight up and down like a field goal post. It's got kind of a lean to it. So we're going to be matching that lean. And now again, this is not perfect science. This is kind of eyeballing. But you're going to be matching that with the rod, right? So if you take an imaginary line in between these two, like a laser, and shine it straight up, you want to be perpendicular to that. Same thing as installing cables, right? Same theory, same philosophy, school thought, whatever you want to call it. But that is no different than installing cable in the crown, right? Yep, so we've drilled a linear hole, right? And this is arguably the hardest part of the whole process, is drilling that hole, because you're going to be taking the Forstner bit out of the hole hog, and you're going to be sticking in probably one of these large auger bits, right? These aren't tiny things, right? They stick out quite a ways from the bit. And something we haven't talked about yet is I'm standing on the ground, which makes this really convenient, right? If you are having to do this in a union that is 12 feet off the ground, either hopefully you have a spider lift or a bucket, some sort of aerial platform that will help you. If not, you're gonna have to don some climbing gear and get some really good work positioning to take this huge bit. I mean, look how far away you got to be from the trunk to start this, right? It's not an easy process. So it's very, very dependent on how high this union is off the ground, etc., etc. But drilling the hole is the critical part. Now, this whole hog is nice. It has enough torque, and as long as your battery has enough juice, you don't really necessarily need to clean out the hole as you go. For those of you that have done cabling, you can kind of notice when you're using the drill, sometimes you gotta drill in and then pull it out to clear the debris a little bit. You may still need to do that in some of these, but this has a lot of torque to be able to just power through everything and make a nice straight hole on the other side. Okay? You guys still with me? Questions?
I've had one issue with just powering through,
Yes.
and that was getting the bit
Back out. Yeah.
Once it had all the chaff around it.
Mhm.
So I'm going to suggest that you clean out
Clean
the
out.
hole
Yeah.
every yeah, I don't know, 6-8 inches.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Everybody hear that? Yeah, definitely, like, take your time. I'm not saying you have to power through it, right? I'm saying this has more power than just the drill that we use for cabling. So we've drilled our hole. We've drilled one of our holes. We're not drilling all of them at the same time. Step 8, using a Forstner bit, remove any bark that may impede the washer from seating against sound wood on the opposite side of the trunk, using the auger bit hole as an indicator for Forstner bit placement. Now, this is kind of counterintuitive because Forstner bits have a little point on the end of them that help you steady that large diameter bit. If you have a hole that doesn't let you do that, it can get kind of jumpy, right? So, do you have to use a Forstner bit? No, you can use a chisel, right, to help with this, but do your best to get rid of the bark if there is any, so that we're not squishing bark against it. Because again, the whole point of this is to support the union by basically tightening these washers and nuts together to basically close that union, or at least support it. If you're closing it on squishy material, over time, you know, freeze thaw, it might back itself off. Okay, we're going to talk about the hardware that prevents that, but still. Step 9, install the threaded rod into the hole. Install the flat washer, lock washer, and nut onto either side. Flat washer for 3/4 inch threaded rod. Lock washer for 3/4 inch threaded rod. Nut for 3/4 inch threaded rod, okay? You'll find all 3 of these pieces in each of the appropriate boxes, okay? The 7/8 ones are dyed green because I didn't know that's what I was ordering, but they are green. I know you guys probably can't see this, but put the washer on the threaded rod, lock washer goes second, and then you're gonna be threading the nut on, right? Now, those of you that saw me take this and just beat this rod through, what's the problem with just beating a rod through?
Mushroom out the thread.
You mushroom out the threads, right? So, if you are mushrooming out the threads, what does that make it difficult to do? Screw the nut on, exactly, yep. So, I'm not gonna struggle here and do it right now because I'm trying to preserve as much of this rod as I can for actual use. But you would thread this nut on, right? And if you've got 6 foot of rod, you don't need that much, right? So you're going to be taking a grinder and cutting off and leaving maybe 3 or 4 inches, right? Thread the nut on, blah, 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 get it in there, okay?
What should I do if I need to beat the rod through so it doesn't mushroom it out?
You can, well, like you guys were just talking about,
I
yep.
think we'll make you a tool
We'll have a nice tool.
that will keep that. They make a long, deep nut. Well, the nubbin on the end of it, so you can pound on it. Destroy your threads.
Yep, yep. I was just being lazy this morning.
You can also just put a nut on it.
Yes.
And a nut ahead of any pounding is a great idea.
Yep. Also, if you're careful, and like let's say you're in this predicament like I am in the field, if you're careful with the grinder, you can give yourself a new thread, but that's also a great way of destroying the threads. So you get down to this point, right? And we've got both the flat washer, the lock washer, and the nut on either side. This is where you start cranking, okay? These are nice because they're ratcheting, right? You can take this and you can just start tightening. You don't have to take them off every time like you're using this end, right? Like you're replacing a grapple hose. You're going to tighten, like it says. Yeah, step 10, if one side of the threaded rod protrudes too far, it may be cut shorter. Be careful to not damage the threads on the rod, like I did putting this in this morning. Step 11, use a ratcheting box wrench on either nut. Tighten the nuts as much as possible in unison. That's a critical part. If you, let's say I don't have any hardware on that side, and I've threaded my nut on, and I'm just going over here and just cranking. I've got no hardware on that side. What am I doing?
Spinning. You're
Just spinning, just pushing it out. Yeah, I'm not doing anything. So the important part is to have, if it's small enough, you can have both of these in either hand and cranking these, right? However, it's usually not that easy. So this is where it's nice to have two people to do this. You're both going to be cranking this down in unison. Step 12, cut any remaining threaded rod that protrudes further than 1/2 inch from the tightened nuts. So you've got your nuts here, and you've still got, 2, 3, 4 inches of rod sticking out. Doesn't look very nice. It's also probably a hazard for kids if the rod is low enough. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna carefully take a grinder and you're gonna leave about 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch. There's no science behind that, but just keep it short, right? Once you cut that, step 13, using a hammer, peen the last thread of the rod over on either side to ensure the nut does not back out. Now, this step is a little redundant because we've added a lock washer, but redundancy is a good thing when you want to install something that is permanent, right? The lock washer helps keep the nut from backing out. The peening threads will help keep the nut from backing out, okay? Ideally, you would have a larger hammer on your equipment bag on the truck. If you don't, I've given you a nice dunce hammer in here if you forgot one, right? This will still get the job done. I just didn't feel like spending a lot of money on a nice fancy hammer. Plus it's lighter. That's in there, that will live in there. All right. And then finally, 14, repeat steps 5 through 13 for each rod needed to support the union. Rod placement should be determined in the work order, and installation should proceed from highest to lowest rod. So all of that process was for one rod. How many rods do we need for this one in particular? 3. 3 rods, because again, it's 27.5 below the union, right? And if we look at that fancy table that's in the A300 book, they say anywhere from 20 to 40 inches, you need at least 3 3/4 inch rods, and an additional rod for every 8 inches above that. Questions?
Where are...
Up.
There it is, right here. Thin bark trees?
Yes.
Like say like a red maple.
Uh-huh.
Would you remove the bark there or no?
No. Thank you for bringing that up. On thin bark trees, for hopefully you're not brace riding a tree that looks as dead as this one. But yes, on thin bark trees like red maples, maybe sycamores sometimes, you do not need to take the Forstner bit and get rid of that bark, right? Because the bark is negligible. But on cottonwoods, oak trees, anything that's got chunky bark, you want to get rid of that. Yep.
Or do you need to countersink the washer? Bigger bark trees, you have to countersink into the wood. But
Right.
bark trees,
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Where are the auger bits in the actual rods going to live?
Where are the auger bits and the actual rods going to live? That's a great question. They, at the moment, they're living up in the mezzanine. I think ideally they will live out here in the container with the rest of the cabling gear, including these boxes. Right. Other questions?
So you said that the regional managers are going to have more of a part in throwing a number on it. What exactly are they going to? Are they going to like have like a picture with like a diagram of where they want it on the tree?
Yeah. So the book does a really nice job of telling us how many rods you're going to need, right? And I didn't print this section out, but there are different installation techniques, right? Like Mac mentioned earlier, right? You want about 12 inches between the rod. In that book, it says the bottom rod should not be seated below the seam, right? Obviously, if the seam goes all the way to the ground, like you're not just putting a rod under the, in the roots. So use common sense, but ideally, the RM would have, in my opinion, a picture from the side and a picture from the front. The side picture is probably giving you, a marked up picture with some dots of where they see the rods going. And then this picture would have a drawn line of the rods themselves, right? McKee, does that seem reasonable?
Yeah, I'm going to go get that top measurement today, actually.
Okay, awesome.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. So, however, and this I'm not requiring you guys to know this, but it is good if you do know it. There are different installation types. So you've got a single rod like this installation, but if you look back at our handy dandy table, when are you only putting one rod in?
Small diameter tree.
Small diameter trees, yes, thank you, Storm. So if you are putting a brace rod in for a tree that has anything below 8 inches, which is reasonable, you might put some brace rods in a small redbud, a dogwood, right? Something that they don't want splitting out, or maybe did split out but is still attached after ice storm, something like that. You only need to put in one rod, right? Now, again, we're getting down to the small size, which is easier to install, right? And this is 1/2 inch, it can go smaller than this. But the single rod installation, then there is multiple rods, but in parallel with each other, right? That is good for, I think if I remember, I think it's good for, they described it as medium-sized trees. So again, this gives you a little bit of leeway, but you're putting the rods in parallel with one another. They say large trees, you're gonna do alternate. And what does alternate mean? That means if you've got multiple rods, right, you don't wanna put them in parallel. Like this top rod might be parallel because it's in the union or above the union, but the next rod might be like this, the next rod might be like this, and the next rod might be like this, right? Now, why is that? Anybody have an idea?
Better hold so it doesn't split.
What's that?
Better hold.
Yeah,
So it doesn't split.
better hold, right? We're talking about wood grain. Wood grain isn't perfectly parallel, right? It's a tree. I mean, it's never going to be totally perfect. But yes, an alternate is going to give you more stability than a parallel one, right? And then lastly, I think they say for very large trees, you can do a parallel system, but have multiple rods per layer, right? So if you're doing like some crazy giant brace rod, you can have 2 above the union, right? Like this. And then you might have, the next layer might have 2 from there, and so on and so forth, right? Because it's so wide. Does that make sense? Now again, I'm not requiring you all to know this. If you want to know it and you do know it, that's great. But this is all part of the RM planning for the work order, right? Ideally, for the work order, you will have 2 pictures, one from the side and one from the front, to give you a pretty close idea of what they want to put in the tree. Alex.
So just visually speaking,
Yes.
like, on this tree, where would you be placing the other 2 rods?
On this tree, where would you be placing the other 2 rods? Good question. So on this tree personally, if we recall, we need to do about 12 inches down. So this top rod, again, this would be higher up. I just don't have any more lead here. So imagine this is higher up. 12 inches down, you can do another one above the union, right? Or, and this is kind of where it goes back to looking at reading the tree, you can leave this one up high and then you start in that seamed area, put another rod, and then 12 inches down from there, another one, right? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Would you alternate that?
What's that?
Put 2 below the union, would you alternate it?
I would have to go back and reference the sizing. I think they give you sizes, but I can't recall what they are right now. Yeah.
Do you have any advice for anyone who might be doing a cable in the future where the auger bit is not long enough to go through the entire tree, or through a union that's just like super spread out?
Yes. So good question. So Corey said, do you have any advice for someone that gets to a tree, and are you saying realizes they don't have an auger bit long enough, or already drilled the hole?
Dealer's choice.
Ideally, you wouldn't have already drilled the hole. You would look at this and go, this isn't long enough, and then go, I need a longer extension or a longer auger bit, whatever it might be. If you get into the trouble of where you have drilled this through and you don't have pretty much any more bit, really the process stops, right? You shouldn't get to this point to begin with, but you would need a longer extension to finish that hole. You never want to start one hole and then try and match it up on the other side. You will miss every time. There's no way, absolutely no way. So that's a good question. But yes, ideally, and again, this is easy because we're standing on the ground and we can kind of eyeball it from here. But if the if the union's way up here, you may kind of have to just be like,
Do you have a longer extension yet?
What's that?
Do you have a longer extension yet?
I do not have a longer extension yet, but one is hopefully on the way.
Can you put 2 extensions together?
Can you put 2 extensions together? You can. I wouldn't recommend it because it's going to get real wobbly, right?
And if that extension comes apart,
By rod or threaded rod,
trees that
auger
were
bit.
saying earlier, pull it out. There's a tree in Upper Arlington that has one of my auger bits. Probably gone now because that was 40 years ago. But
Yeah.
I got one in.
Yep.
Got it to the point where he couldn't pull it back out.
Yeah.
No, I mean, we were cooking the drill.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
was with a large corded drill
Yeah.
compared to what we have today.
Right.
And it just locked out. We ended up leaving the bit in.
Yeah.
I had no other choice.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
keep that hole clean. Don't use any more extensions than you have to.
Yep.
And personally, I would use a shorter bit to get your first portion of the hole, and then go to the long one.
Yeah. Everybody hear that? Those are great recommendations. Use a shorter bit to kind of give yourself a little bit of a pilot, and then change to the longer bit. Especially, that's a great point, especially if you have to climb and do it. Yeah, way better work positioning. You're not like trying to do this around the stem, right? Like that's not good for anybody. Other questions? Andy?
So, I've always used 2 nuts on the end, tightening it together. And then we decided maybe lock washer
Yep.
would, make it a little bit less intrusive, not stick out as far as Now seeing it on a tree,
Yes.
it looks like it's going to sit really nice on that side, but you're going to be on an angle on that other side. Are you concerned about the lock washer not seating necessarily? And what are your thoughts on that?
I am not like these, like especially if you're tightening these down, these washers will bend a little bit. Now, if you're really concerned about it, I don't think it's inappropriate to stack another washer behind this. The lock washer, I think, is going to flatten out either way because you're just like you're cranking this down as hard as you can go, right? Like it's physically possible. I think if they,
You mentioned you had some bevel washers too.
there are bevel washers for cables, for the Rig Guy hardware cables. I don't think anyone makes a bevel washer specifically for brace rods, but I haven't personally looked into that. So
I think you're also going to find that your fibers of your main wood are
Yeah.
going to collapse enough.
Yep.
I've actually done studies on construction. They don't use lock washers anymore.
really,
Yep.
fair enough. Yeah.
Because until that lock washer is fully compressed, it really doesn't do anything.
Yeah.
And so in construction now, you use a flat washer, you lock them down as tight as you can, cut it off 1/2 inch like you talked about, peen it so it can't back off.
Yep. Yeah. And that's where, yeah, and like you said, you know, again, this is the ideal scenario, right? To where you can't get this lock washer all the way down, but that's why peening is that redundancy on the end of this. Lock washer ideally will help the nut stay seated, but the peening is going to make sure it doesn't come off, right? And again, that's just taking the hammer and basically mashing all the threads on the end of that little 1/2 inch nub that you've got.
You don't even have to mash all of them.
Yeah, just
good
the
solid
one
is
end.
on one side.
Yep.
That one back off.
Yep. Just bink. Just one solid hit. Yeah, with the little guy. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions? Who here has never learned about brace rods until today? Sweet. It's all good info, all right? This is definitely a service that we have not historically done very often, but ideally we'll be selling more of because it's a great thing, especially in unison with cabling, right? We do a lot of cabling, we do a lot of pruning, but brace rods themselves have not been something we've done a whole lot of. Hopefully that's changing here in the future. I've tried to design this to make it as easy for you all, right? To have all the hardware you need and all the tools you need in one spot. But yeah, look for hopefully for more of these coming down the pipe.
Will one of those books be in there?
What's that?
One of the cabling books?
Will one of the cabling books be in here? They certainly can be. This is the only one I have right now, but I can get another one.
Cabling and bracing, whatever.
Yep, I was also planning on one of these installation sheets. I'll laminate and put that in here, just like the cabling boxes have a laminated step-by-step process. But yeah, both of those things can definitely live in here. Other questions?
Just to clarify, our policy is going to be washer, lock washer, nut, cut,
Peen. Yes. Yep. Exactly. Yep. Yep. Washer, lock washer, nut, cut off to about 1/2 inch, peen the last thread over to make that redundancy, right? And again, this is a very, very, very permanent installation, right? Especially if you lose an auger bit. It's a permanent, right? There really isn't necessarily a lifespan on brace rods. They're in there for the life of the tree. I guess on that note, has anybody actually removed a tree that they've found brace rods in? TJ? Yeah, you found one? Where at?
Up in Marblehead, we were actually removing an ash tree along Lake Erie.
Yeah.
And it had 3 brace rods in it that were completely enclosed the tree.
Yeah. Yeah. There's some hazards to that, right? Especially if you're planning on chipping. Right?
Yeah.
So definitely something to be leery of. I can't necessarily give you a great example, but those of you that have all seen, you know, cables that have been totally compartmentalized, you can kind of see those, right? So just be on the lookout if you've got a giant removal that looks like it's had a seam and it looks like there's been work done to it. Just be like, kind of question it. Just kind of like you've questioned maybe a really old tree with a cavity in it, might have concrete in it, you know? That's gonna be a horrible day, but it might have concrete in it. So just keep those things in mind. Any other questions on the tooling, on the table we went over, installation? Steve?
Like, if you had to put 4 wood rods in a tree, how long would that typically take?
Yeah, how long does the process take? Yeah, so Steve's question was, if you got to put 4, and let's say, so like we have a job ideally coming up relatively soon that we're going to be putting 4 7/8 rods in this enormous swamp white oak. It's got a big co-dominant union at the ground. How long does that take? Ideally, like with nothing going wrong, your batteries are fully charged, you've got a bit long enough, like all these things, I would say just for the rods, anywhere from about, I'm gonna say 2 to 4 hours, right? 2 hours is cooking, right? 4 hours if you've got some problems. Is that reasonable? Do you have experience with it? Yeah? Yeah.
They take time getting that rod to there.
Yep. Definitely.
Or even the drill bit.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And that's where, again, and like these drill bits aren't going to last forever, right? Drill bits get dull, right? So if you've got a dull drill bit, that's going to take a lot longer. It's going to take a lot more muscle to shove that through there. So, but yes, ideally, if you're just doing the brace rods, I would say like for something that large, probably 2 to 4 hours. If you're doing the little ones, like for magnolia or maybe a redbud, probably an hour. Like the little ones are definitely easier to work around, right? So it depends on the size, it depends on how many you're gonna be installing, and where it is, right? And the height, that's probably the biggest factor. Yeah. So, any other comments, questions?
As a climber, you roll up on a tree that seems to be properly brace rodded
Yep.
to the ground.
Mm-hmm.
You go up in the tree, everything looks proper in the tree.
Yep.
Are we allowed to rest our feet or climb on the brace rods?
Yes. Yes, I would say so. Have you worked for someone that said otherwise?
No, I was just curious.
Okay, yeah. I was also just curious. But yes, I mean, these rods, especially like the 7/8 inch rod, has a tensile strength of 125,000 PSI. And if you're putting 4 of them in, like that's a lot of PSIs. So these rods, I mean, they may seem kind of ridiculous. You're like, well, you're putting in this 7/8 inch steel rod, you're putting 4 of those in a tree that's like, 40, 50, 60 inches or whatever it might be. It's like, is this really gonna add that much strength to it? The answer is yes. Like if you're compressing all of that, especially in conjunction with cabling up top, right? If you've got cabling, you've done a little bit of end weight reduction and you've installed a brace rod in there, that's probably the maximum that we could possibly ask to help preserve the structure of that tree, right? Unless you really want to get into it and you want to start installing props, maybe. Any other questions? I know we're kind of running over time, but this is important. Okay? If you have more questions in the future, please don't be afraid to call me. I'll have this book in the office if you want to reference it. I will get another copy for this box. But yeah, hopefully we'll be doing more of these in the future because it is a really good service and it's something that we are definitely capable of doing.